They laughed when she picked up the broken violin, dusty, stringless in places, more a relic than an instrument. To them, she was just a poor woman with trembling hands and no place on a stage. But when her bow touched the strings, silence fell. Not because it was bad, but because it was beautiful. No one expected that. They forced her to play to humiliate her, never thinking she'd awaken forgotten hearts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more powerful stories like this on The Wrong Stage in the Right City. The wind clawed through the narrow streets of Manhattan like it had somewhere to be. It sliced past the tower of glass and concrete known as the Juilliard School, curling around the statues and stone of Lincoln Center before disappearing into the gray blur of a city that had no time for hesitation. But Nina Morales wasn't moving. She stood still at the foot of the building, her right hand locked tightly around the handle of a violin case that had long since lost its luster. The case was wrapped in an old denim jacket, frayed at the sleeves and spotted from years of weather. Her fingers, reddened by the cold, tightened against the leather grip not because she was cold, but because it was the only thing she could control. Around her, the world continued without pause. People brushed past her, some casting a glance, most not. That was New York. The city didn't look at you unless you demanded its attention. And Nina Morales, with her second-hand coat and boots with the soles coming loose, wasn't the kind of girl people noticed, at least not in the way they did the others walking up those steps today. The others were easy to spot, students with glossy instrument cases slung over shoulders, coats that cost more than her rent, expressions groomed by years of expectation. They didn't glance at the girl standing too still near the curb. They didn't ask why she looked like she had just arrived from another world. Because in their eyes, she had. Nina shifted her weight. Her legs ached, not from the walk uptown, but from the weeks leading up to this day. She had worked late shifts at a corner cafe in Brooklyn, taken double bus routes to save subway fare, and practiced through nights so cold her fingers sometimes bled. This audition wasn't just an opportunity. It was everything. It was the final thread in a life unraveling quietly ever since her mother's breath left the world in the dark corner of a hospital room. She hadn't cried that night. She didn't know why. Maybe the tears had gone dry years ago when her mother first got sick, or maybe because the grief hadn't found its way into music yet. Her mother had once said that real music didn't come from perfect technique, it came from the pieces of you that broke and still kept singing. Nina had spent her whole life learning how to break quietly. Now she had one chance to turn it into sound. Inside, the building exhaled warmth and polish. The walls gleamed. The air was thick with quiet anticipation and the sweet varnish of prestige. Names hung on walls in gold letters. Banners fluttered announcing the Global Rising Virtuosos Showcase. The audition. The kind of opportunity that changed everything. The kind that never belonged to girls like her. As Nina approached the check-in table, a young woman with a headset glanced up, lips parting slightly in surprise at the girl standing in front of her with a weather-beaten case and no makeup. Her name tag read Melinda. "Are you here to deliver something?" she asked, almost gently. Nina's expression didn't flinch. "I'm here to audition." Melinda blinked. "Check the list." Her finger hovered uncertainly. "Name?" "Nina Morales." A pause. Then a small nod, reluctant. "You're the last slot. Room C, down the left hallway. They're a little backed up." Nina nodded once, thanked her, and turned without explanation. She walked past rows of students warming up, their scales and arpeggios mingling into a metallic hum. Some glanced up at her, curiosity flashing behind designer lenses. She passed a girl tuning a cello wrapped in velvet, a boy whispering a tempo count under his breath, a trio practicing synchronized entrances. No one said hello. No one offered space. But a few stared. She was used to the stares. It was the same look she got when she played on subway platforms, when she stepped onto public buses with her violin, when she stood in line at food banks with sheet music poking from her bag. It wasn't disgust. It was something worse. Pity. She reached room C just as someone walked out with a case strapped like a weapon to his back. He didn't see her. His world didn't include people like her. But inside that room, she knew, decisions were being made that would echo far beyond a stage. The door creaked as she entered. 12 students sat in chairs along the perimeter, spaced like threats. Their postures screamed confidence. One was eating almonds from a glass jar. Another practiced vibrato with her eyes closed. All wore variations of elegance, pressed slacks, silk scarves, polished shoes. Nina looked down at her jeans. The knees were thin, almost see-through. The hem of her coat was coming loose. A boy with slick back hair and a blazer that shimmered slightly in the fluorescent light leaned toward a girl next to him. He didn't whisper. He wanted her to hear. Did someone let the cleaning crew in early? The girl giggled, not cruelly, but familiarly, like someone who had learned early that it was safer to laugh with the lions. Nina sat in the far corner, placing her violin case on her lap, cradling it like a child. Her fingers moved instinctively over the folds of denim, as if checking that it was still real. The room's door opened again, and a tall faculty member stepped inside. Gray coat, clipboard, expression like carved marble. "Charles Mendelssohn," she called. "You're next." The boy in the shimmering blazer rose smoothly, casting a final look at Nina. His smirk didn't fade. After he left, the whispers began. They didn't bother hiding them. "I didn't know Juilliard accepted charity cases. Maybe she's one of those social projects. I hope she doesn't cry." Nina didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt. But because she had made a choice long ago, she would never let anyone hear her pain unless she turned it into music. And then, as if the universe wanted to twist the knife, Charles returned after his audition. He walked straight up to her, holding something in his hand. "Here," he said. "In case yours doesn't work." He handed her an old violin. It was one of the student models from the closet, chipped varnish, warped wood, strings dulled by time. The kind used for props in theater productions. She looked at him for a long second. Then took the violin. Not out of spite. Out of silence. Out of belief that the music came from her, not the wood. Her name was called. She stood. The room hushed, waiting for the punchline. But as she walked past them, violin in hand, something shifted in her shoulders. She was still small, still quiet, still wearing her thrift store armor. But her silence wasn't empty anymore. It was loaded. Something inside her had started to burn. And she was about to let it rise. She stepped toward the audition stage with the weight of a city behind her, and something heavier in her hands. A cracked instrument. A lifetime of being overlooked. And the final words of a mother who had given her everything and left her with nothing but a song. That was all she needed. Because today, she wouldn't just audition. She would interrupt. Time did not move on the stage. It waited. Nina Morales stood in the pool of light as if suspended, not by spotlight, but by the anticipation of something sacred. The room around her, the polished auditorium, the layered silence, the rows of judging eyes, seemed to dissolve into a blur of distance. She couldn't hear the whispers anymore. Not the laughter, not the words. Only her own breath. Steady. Quiet. Measured like a heartbeat before a leap. She adjusted the violin. It wasn't hers. The instrument in her hands had been handed to her with a smirk, a joke she had chosen to accept. The chin rest was splintered, the strings faintly corroded, the bow a relic from a forgotten closet. But she touched it the way a surgeon touches scarred skin, delicately, reverently, as if healing were possible through care alone. The judges watched from below, some with bemusement, others with silent judgment. The panel knew talent. They'd seen it burn brightly and disappear. But they weren't watching for greatness now. They were watching for confirmation of a failure. A girl like her didn't walk into Juilliard and rewrite expectations. She walked in and confirmed them. Nina closed her eyes. And the world, for a moment, belonged only to memory. She remembered nights sitting on the cold linoleum floor of the community center in Albuquerque, watching rain leak through a crack in the window while her teacher lit a space heater and said, "Close your eyes when you play." Not to escape. To remember. She remembered her mother in the audience of No One, clapping for a street performance that earned nothing but dust. And she remembered the promise she made when the hospital finally turned off the machines. Play like your soul is bigger than the room. She lifted the bow. It began as nothing. A whisper. A breath of sound, so thin it barely reached the first row. But it carried something more than volume. It carried ache. The first note wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was pure. Piercing. And human in a way no one had expected. It hovered in the air like a held confession, then was answered by the next note. Stronger. Sharper. The third came like a quiet defiance, and with it, something subtle but irreversible shifted. Someone coughed, and then stopped midway. One of the judges leaned forward, their chin lifted, as if to see more clearly. Nina had launched into Piazzolla's Libertango. Not the usual showcase piece. Not the safe choice. But it didn't feel like rebellion, it felt like truth. Like this girl, standing in worn boots and playing a borrowed violin, was writing something in the air that had waited too long to be spoken. She played as though every fiber in her body remembered a pain it hadn't yet released. Her left hand danced along the fingerboard, agile but firm. Her right arm was a metronome of intensity, coaxing fire and light from strings that should have only given dust. She had no need for embellishment. Her playing didn't seek to impress. It stripped the music to its marrow and rebuilt it, not for the audience, but for herself. From the mezzanine, someone gasped. From the back row, a student rose unconsciously, eyes wide. The melody surged, and with it came a momentum impossible to resist. She let the rhythms gallop, then fall. Her dynamics whispered, screamed, whispered again. The room was no longer a room. It was a chamber of memory and fury and longing. She became the pulse of the piece, her body swaying slightly, but her face motionless, carved in focus, her eyes closed as if in prayer. What had once been background mockery was now stunned awe. The same mouths that had laughed now hung open, caught somewhere between disbelief and revelation. She climbed into a crescendo with terrifying control. The runs, intricate and merciless, fell from her fingers with mechanical precision and emotional clarity. Each passage spoke not only of practice but of purpose. A kind of discipline that wasn't taught in private schools but forged in silence, hunger, and necessity. Down below, Dr. Moore gripped the edge of the table. Another judge whispered, "That's not possible." In the second row, a violinist named Charles sat frozen, face pale. The smugness was gone. In its place, something Nina had no interest in, regret. But she didn't play to silence him. She played for everything that had never been said, never been seen. She played for every moment she had practiced in the dark while the heater hummed beside her. For every night she walked home with sore feet and calloused fingers. For every time someone turned their back when she asked to be heard. This was not performance. This was release. Her bow shivered on the final high note, tight, taut, perfect. And then, nothing. No note. No echo. No movement. Just the absence of sound. And in that absence, truth. She opened her eyes. The light above her was now too bright. The silence was no longer cruel. It was reverent. Sacred. No one clapped. Not immediately. They didn't know if they should. They weren't sure if what they'd witnessed had rules. Then, finally, someone in the back row stood and put their hands together. A single clap. Then another. Then the flood broke. The room erupted. Students stood. Professors rose. There was no protocol now. Applause rang not like celebration, but confession. Nina remained still. She didn't bow. Not yet. Instead, she looked out over them, not with defiance, but with understanding. She knew what they had seen. What they had not expected. What they could not unsee. The broken girl. The broken violin. The performance that made everything else look small. Down near the wings, a younger assistant whispered to a colleague, that's how Reyes used to play it. But the name hadn't been spoken aloud yet. That would come soon. For now, all they knew was this. She came with nothing. And somehow, she gave them everything. She bowed once, briefly. Then turned, and walked off the stage. And the silence that followed her exit was not empty. It was changed. They didn't know her name when she walked in. They would not forget it when she walked out. The applause still echoed, distant now, like the aftershock of something holy. But Nina Morales had already left the stage. She walked through the side corridor of the auditorium in a haze of quiet, her steps slow, deliberate, as if her body hadn't quite returned from where the music had taken her. Behind her, the judges still sat in stunned silence. In all their years of adjudicating, they had seen brilliance, precision, even genius. But not this. Not the quiet kind of devastation that reshaped the room without asking permission. Not the kind of performance that reminded you how small your definitions of greatness really were. In the panel's silence, Dr. Evelyn Moore finally stood. She had felt the notes in her ribcage, like a second heartbeat. She had watched the girl's hands move as if they belonged to something older than her body. And now, in the absence of explanation, she found herself desperate for one. A door creaked as she followed Nina backstage. The hallway was dimly lit, lined with gray lockers and posters for past recitals. Nina was leaning against the far wall, the violin resting on her lap like an exhausted child. Dr. Moore approached, heels echoing like metronome ticks against the linoleum. Nina. The girl lifted her eyes, steady, unreadable. I have to ask, Moore said softly, where did you learn to play like that? There was no pride in Nina's face. No defense. Just quiet clarity. I was taught, she said. But not here. Not anywhere like here. Then where? Nina hesitated, not out of secrecy, but out of the weight she was about to place into the air. Emiliano Reyes. The name landed like a breath caught in the throat. Dr. Moore blinked. Excuse me. I studied with Emiliano Reyes. For 6 years. He was my only teacher. The hallway felt colder now, as if the walls had absorbed the implications. Reyes. The name wasn't just a footnote in musical history, it was a phantom. A ghost that hovered over practice rooms and rehearsal halls, whispered about in the same tone reserved for legends and loss. He had disappeared over a decade ago, after the accident, after the silence. His disappearance was folklore. Some said he moved to Europe, others that he'd lost the ability to play and refused to be seen again. No one imagined he had been quietly mentoring a girl in New Mexico. And certainly not this girl. Are you saying, he trained you personally? Moore asked, her voice caught between skepticism and awe. Nina nodded once. At the Rio Mesa Community Center. He volunteered there. No one knew who he was. At first, neither did I. But why you? Nina's voice softened. He said I didn't play to impress. I played to remember. Moore looked away, her throat tightening. The quote, it was something Reyes had said in a rare interview before he vanished, music is memory made audible. And he never told anyone. He didn't want to be found, Nina said. He said the world only listened when it was convenient. He didn't want convenience. He wanted quiet. He wanted honesty. The judge folded her arms, staring at the floor, as if the pieces of a long unsolved puzzle had just realigned. Why didn't you say this before? Why not include it in your application? Because this audition wasn't about him, Nina said. It was about what he gave me. And what he asked me to protect. The moment held. Dr. Moore saw it now, not just the talent, but the cost. She saw the empty subway stations, the unheated rooms, the moments Nina had played through hunger or grief without ever imagining someone would listen. This wasn't discipline taught by institutions. This was discipline grown in isolation. A cathedral built of silence and will. You know what this means, don't you? Moore said finally. This changes everything. But Nina's gaze didn't change. I don't want everything, she said. I want something specific. Moore raised an eyebrow. What is it? If you offer me the solo, Nina said, I'll say no. The words landed softly, but with the weight of a door slamming shut. Moore's expression turned to confusion. You'd refuse? I would, Nina said, gently. I don't want the spotlight. I want a scholarship. In Reyes's name. For kids who don't get here. Who never even try, because they know they can't afford to fail. That's not something we decide lightly. I know, Nina said. But if this performance meant anything to you, to any of you, it can't end with me. Behind them, the door creaked open again. One of the younger faculty members, Clara Nunez, stood in the doorway, breathless. I heard you say Reyes, she said. Are you serious? Nina nodded. He taught me. Every week. Until he got sick. Clara stepped closer, visibly moved. I used to listen to his Carnegie recordings in college. I played them so often I wore out the digital file. Moore turned toward her. And what would you say if we created something permanent? A legacy? Clara didn't hesitate. I'd say it's overdue. The idea took root that quickly. By the end of the hour, the judges had reconvened. Conversations that began in whispers evolved into possibility. Logistics. Endowments. Names. Nina's name kept returning to the table, but each time she heard it, she corrected them. It should be his. Not mine. They didn't understand. Fame was currency. And she was refusing it. But she wasn't interested in currency. She was interested in change. And the kind of change she had in mind would take more than a standing ovation. Outside, night had begun to stretch across Manhattan like a slow wave of ink. Nina stepped out into the cold without fanfare. She walked slowly, violin still in hand, the same cracked case tucked beneath her arm. The city didn't notice her. But one day, it would feel what she had left behind. She paused at the subway stairs, then turned, not to look back, but to breathe. For the first time that day, she allowed herself a single tear. Not for what she had proven. But for the man who had once placed a hand on her shoulder, after a session so raw she'd nearly collapsed, and said, if the world won't make room for you, build one. She was beginning to. They gathered in the dark. Not in secret, but in shame. 2 nights after the audition, Juilliard's board of artistic directors, senior faculty, alumni representatives, and scholarship administrators sat in a private conference room suspended above Lincoln Center. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan's quiet hum, but inside the room, nothing was still. Pages rustled, whispers flared. It was not business as usual. Not after her. Nina Morales had fractured something. Not destructively, but undeniably. Like a beam of light breaking through a surface that no longer wished to be opaque. On the table in front of Dr. Evelyn Moore lay a proposal. One sheet of paper. No branding. No university letterhead. Just a typed paragraph and a signature at the bottom, Nina's. The words were simple. I propose that Juilliard create a full tuition scholarship fund under the name of Emiliano Reyes, specifically for underrepresented students from underserved communities, to ensure that no voice capable of transforming the world through music is ever silenced by circumstance again. There was no request for fame. No clause for naming rights. No demand for media presence. She wanted the door to stay open, for others, not herself. Dr. Moore hadn't slept. She had reread the proposal over and over. It was less a suggestion and more a quiet indictment. And it echoed louder than the applause that had followed Nina's performance. Across the room, a finance representative cleared his throat. Even if we wanted to launch something like this, he began, our endowments are already allocated. We'd need to reroute development funds, secure donors, coordinate legal. She doesn't want much, Moore said, cutting him off. She wants everything, came a voice from the corner. It was Dr. Felix Lang, a senior panelist and career traditionalist. She's asking us to change what this institution values. No, Moore replied. She's asking us to remember why we exist. There was a pause. Outside, wind pressed faintly against the glass. Lang folded his hands. Are we supposed to pretend that passion is enough? That talent from the street is worth the same as legacy? Because if we do this for her. We're not doing it for her, said a new voice. Clara Nunez had stepped forward. She held no official seat on the board, but her voice now carried weight. The kind you earn when you witness something that rearranges your soul. We're doing it for the kids who never audition. For the ones who think they never had a chance because they never saw someone like Nina in that chair. Lang's mouth tensed, but he said nothing. Moore leaned back. The silence in the room wasn't resistance anymore. It was hesitation. Fear. Not of the change, but of what it revealed. That for years, maybe decades, they'd missed people like her. Missed them because they hadn't known how to listen. She pressed a button on the table. A recording filled the room. Not of Nina's final note, but of her voice, captured on a side mic during the audition. If this performance meant anything to you, it can't end with me. No one moved. Across campus, a different kind of silence had begun to take shape. Students talked in hallways with their phones turned off. Whispers between practice sessions. Glances exchanged that said more than words. A clip from the audition had leaked, though no one had claimed responsibility. It wasn't even the full performance. Just the last 30 seconds. Just the final note. Just her face. Her eyes closed. The broken violin tucked beneath her chin. And that single bow stroke that shook the marrow of the school. #PlayWithSoul had begun trending within 12 hours. But Nina never posted. Never commented. She didn't even own a proper smartphone. She had declined every interview request. Politely. Firmly. Quietly. She wasn't interested in going viral. She was building something. That Saturday, she stood in the corner of a rehearsal room with 10 children between the ages of 8 and 12, all clutching second-hand instruments. The youngest couldn't hold his bow right. The oldest had never heard of sheet music. She smiled at them the way Reyes once had smiled at her. Play the sound your heart makes, she told them. Even if it's messy. They played. It was messy. It was beautiful. 2 weeks later, Juilliard announced the launch of the Reyes Scholarship for Emerging Voices. The press release was brief, subdued. But within hours, donations poured in from former students, philanthropists, anonymous patrons. The proposal Nina had written by hand in her shared apartment was now the cornerstone of a movement. Applications came in from everywhere, from neighborhoods ignored, schools underfunded, towns that never thought to dream Juilliard-level dreams. Video auditions recorded in parking lots. Essays written on borrowed laptops. Passion pressed into digital files. Each one bore the fingerprints of hunger and hope. Inside the school, the atmosphere began to shift. Some resisted, quietly. Some openly. But many, especially the younger students, felt something new: permission. Not to lower the bar, but to move it. To make space for a different kind of excellence. One afternoon, Charles, once proud, now quiet, approached Dr. Moore after a lecture. "I used to think music was about being the best," he said. "Now I think it might be about being true." Moore didn't reply. But later that night, she retrieved the sheet music from Nina's audition. She framed it. In the bottom right corner, where the composer's name was usually typed, Nina had written something in pencil. "You don't need the world's permission to matter." Nina never attended the official ceremony. She received the email about the scholarship launch. She smiled. She went back to teaching. But one afternoon, as she walked past the glass front of Juilliard, she paused. A new banner hung above the entryway. Sleek, modern, bold. The Reyes Scholarship, for those who play with soul. She didn't stop walking. She didn't need to. The door was open now. And that had always been the point. The applause had faded, but the echo never left. Weeks turned into months, and the moment most had expected to be fleeting took root instead. The performance that once filled an auditorium now filled conversations. Not loudly, not in fanfare, but in the quieter shifts that ripple through an institution just before it begins to transform. Nina Morales didn't wait for it. She had already moved on. Not out of disinterest, but because she understood something most people take years to learn: that legacy doesn't grow where attention gathers. It grows in silence, in discipline, in repetition. In the decisions you make when no one is watching. She returned to her routine, if it could be called that. Afternoons spent in the back rooms of a Bronx community center. Mornings teaching scales to children who had never seen sheet music. Some didn't know the names of the strings. Some didn't care. But Nina taught them anyway, with patience born not from a sense of duty, but recognition. She saw in them the echoes of her own beginning: the cracked violin, the subway floor, the dream that felt more like defiance than destiny. She never mentioned Juilliard. Not once. If the kids recognized her, from the blurry videos online, from the whispers of volunteers who knew more than they said, they didn't ask. And Nina didn't offer. She had no need for the spotlight. She had become the light. Back at Juilliard, change crept through the halls not like a revolution, but like restoration. The scholarship, once proposed in a quiet paragraph, now had a committee, a budget, a mission. They named it the Reyes Scholarship for Emerging Voices, but within the student body, it quickly earned another name. The Nina Fund. Not because she asked for it. Because no one else could have inspired it. The institution shifted its audition practices subtly. New evaluators were added. The review process expanded to consider creative background and potential, not just perfection. Outreach programs were piloted in public high schools. Faculty started teaching in community centers twice a semester: no press, no cameras. Just music. Some resisted. They always do. There were murmurs about lowering standards, about bending traditions too far. But the murmurs never became more than that, because the ones who spoke loudest had been there. They had heard the silence Nina created. And silence is hard to argue with. For those who once mocked her, the reckoning came quiet and personal. Charles never offered an excuse. After the performance, he disappeared for a time, not from the school, but from the circles he once dominated. When he returned, he was quieter, more observant. He asked questions. He showed up to Clara Nunez outreach sessions. One day, unannounced, He arrived at Nina's community center with a student violin and asked if he could sit in. She didn't say yes. She just handed him a chair. Sophie, the girl who once stood with ridicule glinting in her eyes, took longer. Her apology wasn't a grand gesture. It came in the form of a letter, left on the desk of Dr. Moore. It read, "I saw what I wanted to see. And I mocked what I was afraid of. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. But it was a start." Dr. Moore herself began to change too. She taught more than she administrated. Walked the halls instead of staying in the tower. She spoke about Nina's audition not as a disruption, but as a moment of necessary clarity, the reminder that institutions must serve people, not pride. One early spring afternoon, Juilliard hosted a small commemorative recital in the West Hall, not for press, not for donors, but for the students who were now beneficiaries of the scholarship. 7 of them performed. Each came from a story too heavy for most to carry. But they played. With conviction. With something like freedom. In the front row, an empty seat bore a single rose. It wasn't labeled. But everyone knew who it was for. Nina never arrived. She was across town, walking a timid girl named Lily through her first vibrato. Lily was 10, shy, with nervous fingers and a gaze that darted like she expected to be corrected. That day, she had paused mid-note and looked up. "Miss Nina," she whispered, "do you ever get scared to play?" Nina paused. The room smelled of old resin and pencil shavings. She knelt beside her. "All the time," she said. "But I play anyway. Not because I'm not afraid. But because the music deserves to be heard." Lily nodded. Her bow hand steadied just a little. As the lesson ended, Lily hesitated at the door. She turned back and said, "I heard about you, the audition, the scholarship. Everyone says you changed the school." Nina smiled, slow and kind. "I didn't change anything," she said. "I just reminded them of what matters." Lily considered that. Then she grinned. "I'm gonna play like that one day." Nina gently adjusted the strap of her old case. "You already are." Outside, the sun had begun to fall behind the rooftops, turning the city gold for a fleeting breath. Nina walked alone, as she often did, through streets that no longer felt indifferent. People still passed her without knowing her name. And that was exactly how she wanted it. But somewhere behind her, a door remained open. And someone would walk through it next. Some stories don't begin with applause. They begin in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that follows the sound of a door closing on someone's potential. The kind of silence that sits heavy in empty rooms, in broken instruments, in the hearts of people who are told, over and over, that they do not belong. Nina Morales lived in that kind of silence for most of her life. But she didn't let it define her. She turned it into music. This is the story of how one quiet, unassuming young woman, armed with little more than an old violin and a sacred promise, walked into one of the world's most revered institutions, not to seek validation, but to leave a legacy. And in doing so, she didn't just challenge everything that institution believed about talent, class, and worth, she rewrote the terms entirely. From the moment she stepped through the doors of Juilliard, Nina carried the weight of invisibility. Her clothes didn't shine. Her case wasn't polished. Her presence didn't demand attention. But her silence did. And when she played, truly played, it wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning. She performed a single piece, on a broken violin handed to her as a joke. And yet, that instrument, in her hands, became a weapon, a confession, a prayer. She didn't just play the notes. She excavated every layer of her story through them, the struggle, the love, the grief, the grit. It was a sound that made people stop breathing. Because for the first time in their lives, they were hearing something real. Something unfiltered. Something earned. It would have been enough to impress. To walk away with the solo spot. To take the accolades and let them pour over her like gold. But Nina didn't want gold. She wanted a gate to be opened. She revealed something no one expected, that she had been trained in secret by Emiliano Reyes, a musical legend thought to have vanished from the world. His silence had become her sanctuary. And with that truth, the performance became more than a moment. It became a message. A final chapter to his legacy. And the beginning of hers. She turned down the spotlight. Turned down the solo. Instead, she asked for something radical, a scholarship, not for herself, but for others. A door opened in his name, so that no child with a song inside them would ever again be shut out by cost, by class, by silence. The institution didn't know what to do with that kind of humility. That kind of clarity. But they listened. And slowly, they changed. Nina never returned to claim her place at the top. She didn't need to. She had already built a stage somewhere else. In community centers. In borrowed classrooms. In hearts. Her legacy isn't in the notes she played. It's in the ones that followed. The scholarship in Rhea's name has already begun to shape the lives of young musicians who, like Nina, never imagined someone would make room for them. The auditions are broader now. The conversations deeper. The vision bigger. All because one girl refused to make music for applause. She made it for meaning. The lessons we carry. So what does Nina's story teach us? First, it reminds us that greatness doesn't always come dressed the way we expect. It doesn't arrive in designer coats or glittering resumes. Sometimes it shows up quietly, wrapped in denim, holding something broken. And if we aren't looking for it, if we aren't listening, we'll miss it. Second, it shows us that rejection isn't the end. It's often the beginning of something far more meaningful. Nina wasn't chosen. She chose herself. She showed up anyway. She played anyway. And because she did, she turned mockery into movement. Third, and most powerfully, her story is a masterclass in using your platform for others. In a world that worships individual success, Nina reminded us that legacy isn't what you gain. It's what you give away. It's the doors you leave open behind you. Her courage didn't just change Juilliard. It changed the conversation. About equity. About access. About art. About what it means to matter. And perhaps most importantly, it showed us that humility is not the absence of ambition. It's the highest form of it. Because Nina understood that applause fades, but impact echoes. How we apply this now. You don't have to be a musician to live like Nina Morales. You don't have to have a gift recognized by the world. You just have to believe that your story matters, and that someone else might rise because you dared to tell it. Maybe you're someone who's been told you don't belong in the room. Maybe you've been underestimated. Overlooked. Underpaid. Silenced. Maybe you've had to fix your instrument with duct tape, or rewrite your dreams every few months just to survive. Let Nina's story remind you, your silence is not a sentence. It's a seed. Your voice doesn't need permission. Your impact doesn't require applause. You are already enough to start changing the world, if not for millions, then for one person who will look at you and finally see possibility reflected back at them. So speak up. Step forward. Don't wait for the perfect stage. Build your own. And when you've made it, whatever that looks like, don't forget the door behind you. Leave it open. Someone else is coming. If this story resonated with you, if Nina's journey stirred something in your heart, we invite you to become part of this community. Subscribe to this channel, not just to follow more powerful stories, but to become a part of them. Your support helps us continue to find and tell stories like Nina's, stories of underdogs, of silent fighters, of quiet legends who carry the world forward one note at a time. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they matter. And remember, you don't need the spotlight. You are the light.